President Donald Trump has promised to impose tariffs on both steel and aluminum coming into the U.S., with a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum. Now, there is going to be a lot to break down here. So I'm going to discuss if I think this is a good thing or not, if it's good for the U.S., and also how this affects my country, Canada. But first, let's get into the reasoning. So how the U.S. will actually be able to impose this tariff. So according to CBC News, to apply the tariffs, the U.S. is invoking a rarely used clause in a 1962 trade law that allows the president to declare tariffs if required by national security. The White House argues that the wording is broad and that national security also could include employment and economic stability of the domestic steel industry. So right off the bat, I think this reasoning is bullshit. National security. National security isn't all that broad. So when we're talking about imposing tariffs, especially on allies like Canada, I don't really understand how national security could be used as the reason for being able to apply these tariffs. And even the Pentagon doesn't seem to think this makes sense and has instead recommended targeted tariffs as to not upset partners. Okay, so I'll have more on how this affects Canada in a minute, but first, let's pretend that this reasoning makes sense. That, sure, national security is a reason that Trump can impose these tariffs. So let's go a little deeper. Apart from Trump, people that support these tariffs are American steelworkers, because this means that there'll be more of a demand for US-made steel, which means more jobs for workers in the steel industry. Sure, but is that the full picture? So I have a clip here from Jake Tapper on CNN who's questioning the Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, Peter Navarro, on how these tariffs will actually affect other jobs.
Lawrence Kudlow, Arthur Laffer, Stephen Moore, all three of them economists, big supporters of President Trump, campaign advisors to President Trump. They wrote in a CNBC article this weekend, quote, President Trump genuinely believes that his steel and aluminum tariffs will save thousands of blue-collar jobs. But even if tariffs save every one of the 140,000 or so steel jobs in America, it puts at risk 5 million manufacturing and related jobs in industries that use steel. And this is an argument that you hear from a lot of Republicans. You might be protecting 140,000 Americans and hurting millions more.
So even if you want to make the jobs argument, that these tariffs will create more U.S. jobs in the steel industry, you are ignoring that this will actually have an adverse effect on other jobs in other industries that use steel and aluminum. Now, one company that has echoed this is Miller Coors, who tweeted out this. Like most brewers, we are selling an increasing amount of our beers in aluminum cans, and this action will cause aluminum prices to rise. It is likely to lead to job losses across the beer industry. We buy as much domestic can sheet aluminum as is available. However, there simply isn't enough supply to satisfy the demands of American beverage makers like us. American workers and American consumers will suffer as a result of this misguided tariff. So there is simply not enough aluminum produced in the US to keep up with the demand for beer, resulting in potential job losses and higher prices for consumers. Now, this takes us to Canada. And as a Canadian leftist, I see this issue a little differently than I imagine most Americans do. So when we look at the countries that this tariff will hurt the most, you see that Canada is up there at the top with 16% of US steel imports coming from my country. And in fact, Canada is the largest supplier of both steel and aluminum in the US. And who's not on the list? China, which only accounts for 2% of US steel imports. So these tariffs will clearly hurt Canada more than anyone else, which also means that they'll hurt Canadian workers more than anyone else. Now, if you are an American, you might not care. And you may even think that these tariffs are needed because of how NAFTA has helped destroy manufacturing work in the US. And Trump does look to be using these tariffs as a way to try and renegotiate NAFTA, saying he might drop the tariffs if Mexico and Canada do what he wants on NAFTA. But did Canadian workers really benefit from NAFTA at the expense of the US? So first we have to understand who actually got hurt from NAFTA. So this from the Star. 80% of Ontario households have seen no real income gains since NAFTA's implementation over 2 decades ago. The American Rust Belt's story isn't any different. A massive migration of new production to Mexico over the last decade has affected the US auto industry, and just as adversely, if not more so, the Canadian auto industry. Auto plants have been shuttered and thousands of high-paying jobs have been eliminated. The dramatic migration in new industry jobs to Mexico has been incentivized by huge wage differentials. Mexican assembly plants are around US $8 an hour, little more than half of Ontario's minimum wage, and a fraction of the wages paid in either American or Canadian plants. It's hardly a coincidence that the last 8 assembly plants built in North America have been located in Mexico. So this idea that only American workers got screwed by NAFTA is uninformed. Both Canadian and American auto workers were negatively impacted to the benefit of Mexico. Now, you might say, well, the auto industry isn't the steel industry. And yeah, I agree with you, which is why there needs to be a unique approach to each industry. You want different countries focusing on the industry that they have an advantage in when compared to other countries. So Canada, for instance, is rich in minerals and things like lumber. So Canada has the resources and infrastructure in place to take advantage of certain industries, just as Mexico and just as the US does. So it makes sense to play nice with Canada on this issue, as the US can't produce what Canada can on steel and aluminum. Now, the other part of this story that I haven't even got to is the potential for an all-out trade war, as Canada vows to fight back if hit with Trump's tariffs. But hopefully we won't have to discuss that, as a trade war benefits nobody. Now, to end on here, and just to summarize this whole argument up, the idea that national security is the reason for, or the excuse to be able to implement these tariffs, is an incredibly flawed reasoning. And on top of that, even if you want to say that these tariffs can be implemented because of national security reasons, it's, in the end, not going to help US jobs as a whole. It might help the US steel industry, but when looking at industries that use steel, it's not going to help them. And even if these tariffs are imposed, Canada, because of our partnership with the US, should clearly be exempt. So overall, I don't think this is a good move by Trump. I can see if you work in the steel industry, you could think this is a great move. But the fact is, the vast majority of people will be negatively affected to the benefit of really just a few thousand. Hey, if you like this video, hit that subscribe button below and consider throwing me a few bucks on Patreon at patreon.com/therationalnational or therationalnational.com/join.